Hello, this is Dr. Eric Bricker, and thank you for watching AHealthcareZ. Today's topic is drivers of employer change in their insurance broker and benefit consultant. So, believe it or not, 1.2 trillion of healthcare spend in America is by employer-sponsored health insurance plans. So it's by the employers in America. And that is 28% of the 4.3 trillion in total that America spends on healthcare annually. And insurance brokers and benefits consultants have a huge influence on how that $1.2 trillion is spent. So, if we want to understand the employer market, then we have to understand the relationship between an employer and their broker and insurance benefit consultant, and what drives an employer to change that relationship, to change their consultant. So I said in a previous video that there's essentially a table of power that has 3 seats on it when it comes to an employer-sponsored health insurance plan. There's the employer, there's the broker consultant, and then there's the health insurance carrier. And those 3 form the triad of how a plan runs and operates. Well, guess what? If the plan isn't going well, then an employer will change out their broker benefit consultant. So let's talk about those changes. So typically what I've seen is that 1, healthcare costs are high for the individual employer. Well, what's new? Healthcare costs are always high. So you might say, well, Dr. Bricker, costs are always high, but they don't change their broker all the time and the costs are still high. Aha! I have seen 2 other things be necessary. You essentially have to, 3 things have to occur at the same time. So 1, the healthcare costs have to be high for the group, but then 2, that there's a regulatory change, and then 3, that there's also a change in the business conditions, in the overall economy as well. And when you get those 3 things combined of high healthcare costs, plus a regulatory change, plus a change in the overall business environment, then I have seen gobs of employers change their broker benefit consultant. Let me give you an example. The Affordable Care Act in 2010 obviously was a huge regulatory change for employers, and in 2010 this was sort of right at the bottom of the great financial crisis. So we were in the midst of the largest recession since the Great Depression. Okay, and so what happened is there were tons of individual group health insurance brokers that had small groups less than 50, small groups less than 100. They even had a lot of groups of 200. I would even see individual brokers that had groups of 500. And it was just one broker, and then maybe he or she had 1 clerical assistant that worked with them, but they were largely on their own. And then, because of the increased regulatory requirements of the Affordable Care Act, those individual brokers, they didn't have the compliance resources. They didn't have the staff. They didn't necessarily have an attorney on retainer, or even maybe their own attorney in-house. And so what happened is all those groups under 50, under 100, under 200, even the ones that are up to 500 that were using an individual broker, they moved to these regional brokerage firms. And so I saw the sort of mid-market brokerage firms that kind of did groups up to 2,000, they started acquiring huge swaths of small groups and groups under 200 business from these individual brokers. The individual brokerage market just got decimated by the combination of the Affordable Care Act plus the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis. Okay, now, today, we potentially have an analogous environment where we have had passage of the CAA, which went into effect in December of 2021, that has new disclosure requirements in regards to the commissions that brokers are receiving from a variety of sources, and they have to show all of their compensation. And what is really going to be seen by employers is that, not for all employers, but for some employers, their brokerage and benefit consulting fees are extraordinarily high when you take into account all of the commissions, and I would argue even all of the override payments that the brokerages are receiving from the carriers. And so there's a real conflict of interest, especially from the major PBMs, because literally these brokerage firms are getting the equivalent of sometimes over $5 PEPM just from the PBM side of the business. So there's a huge conflict of interest. So here you've got an opportunity to move away from a PBM or to move away from an insurance carrier, and there's a conflict of interest. So the broker is not acting in the best interest of the employer. The employer could move to an independent TPA. The employer could carve out their PBM and move to a independent, transparent pass-through PBM. And if their broker consultant is making incredibly high fees off of them, then there's a conflict of interest between what their broker is doing, what their benefit consultant is doing, and what's best for the business. And so here in 2010 with the ACA, now, of course, the third thing we need is an economic slowdown, right? So yes, healthcare costs are extraordinarily high for employers. Yes, we've had a regulatory change, but you have to have this third piece. We have not seen a recession yet in America. Unemployment as of March of 2023 is still sub 4%. In no way, shape, or form is that a recession. So there has to be overall business slowdown. There has to be a decrease in sales. There's got to be some sort of financial pain to the business to then cause this change to occur, to say, look, we have brokers, benefit consultants who have a conflict of interest. They're not financially aligned with our plan. And so what I want to do now is I want to contrast what I've seen as the brokers and consultants that really do act as employer guard dogs. In other words, they really are aligned with the employer and the employee health plan. They're doing everything they can to increase quality and decrease costs and increase access. About increase access, I mean decrease the out-of-pocket costs for the employees. You got to remember, with healthcare costs being high, what that means is that the employee out-of-pocket cost is high, which really means access to care is being restricted. So, ultimately, the conflict of interest of an insurance broker is actually bad for patients' health. I mean, that's why I care about it. The financial conflict of interest of an insurance broker and benefit consultant decreases the access to healthcare for the plan participants, and it's bad for their health. That's why I care about this. So but not all brokers are like this. Listen, there are gobs of brokers that are involved in the 1.2 trillion spend of employer-sponsored health insurance that are total employer guard dogs. And then conversely, there are many insurance brokers and benefit consultants that are just carrier lapdogs. They're just kind of being petted by the carrier. Okay, so let's compare and contrast employer guard dogs versus carrier lapdogs, brokers and consultants. Okay, so let's start off with the carrier lapdogs. Okay, typically the carrier lapdog brokers and consultants, they have a long carrier sales history. They've been a salesperson at a carrier for years, if not decades, and then they move over to the brokerage consulting side. What does that mean? They're essentially still a carrier salesperson. They're just wearing a different hat. Okay, they tend to work at a brokerage that's heavily override driven, meaning they get a whole bunch of these retention bonuses for overall book of business sales with Blue Cross United, Cigna, or Aetna. And how do you know that? Because these brokers and consultants tend to really discourage self-funding for their fully insured groups, and they also tend to really discourage use of TPAs other than the ASO services of Blue Cross United, Cigna, and Aetna, right? Why? Because they're getting paid these huge overrides. Blue Cross United, Cigna, and Aetna are not paying overrides for nothing. They're paying overrides because it's you better not move them to an independent TPA. What am I paying you for? Okay, next up, the team of the lapdogs tends to be very hierarchical, meaning the account team, the producer, various strata of consultants and support folks underneath, where the head broker consultant, the lead on the account, tends to be very detached from the details of the account. I've spoken with them and I'd be like, well, what's the deductible or the copay? They couldn't even tell me. I'm like, this is a huge client of yours, and you can't even tell me the basics of their plan design? Plan design is well within your wheelhouse, and you can't tell me that off the top of your head? I would argue that was something that how do I know that people should know that? Because employer guard dog brokers can almost immediately tell you the specific details about their employer client off the top of their head because they're crazy in the weeds. Okay, next up, interestingly, there is somewhat of a geographic bias to lapdog brokers consultants. They tend to be heavily found in the Northeast. They tend to be found in Chicago. They tend to be found in Denver, okay? Denver is filled with carrier lapdog brokers and consultants. Okay, so what's my basis for this? Okay, so in the Northeast, it's interesting because brokers in the Northeast, like, literally tell me, oh yeah, brokers in the Northeast are terrible. like they tell me that. Like, they're like, the guard dog brokers in the Northeast just like self-admittedly are like, oh yeah, the many of the brokers in the Northeast are really not fighting for their employer clients like they should. Okay, how else do I know that? Because there are many employers in the Northeast that use brokers and consultants that are from Texas, that are from where I'm from. I know brokers and consultants in Texas that have huge accounts in New York City, that have huge accounts in the Washington, D.C. area. I mean, I will tell you that conversely, I have never seen an employer in Texas that uses a broker consultant from the Northeast, right? Because some employers in the Northeast have figured out that they need to get a guard dog where the current environment doesn't have guard dogs. Well, they do, but just not as many, okay? Next up, Chicago. Blue Cross of Illinois has Chicago and the state of Illinois on such lockdown that many of the brokers and consultants really they don't push back against Blue Cross of Illinois. So Chicago's pretty unique in terms of there being carrier lapdogs there. And then lastly, in Denver, again, filled with carrier lapdogs. Why? The Denver market is incredibly fully insured. Like, there's gobs of groups in Denver that should be self-funded that are not. Okay, so fine. Let's go to the guard dogs. Listen, they tend to have no short or a very distant sales career at a carrier. They've been working for employers and been a guard dog for a long time. They haven't recently come over as a carrier sales rep. 2, they offer fixed fees in terms of there are some brokerages, nationwide brokerages, that have completely done away with carrier commissions completely. They've completely done away with them. So the entire model of compensation is different for the guard dog. 3, they totally encourage self-funding. I have been in meetings where the broker is really trying to encourage the group to be self-funded, and the CFO or the CEO might be pushing back. But listen, the broker's trying, and he's tried year after year after year, and I've been in the meetings where he's tried year after year after year, and they're not afraid to use independent TPAs. There are certain situations where the carrier ASO does not make the most sense, and an independent TPA absolutely makes sense, and they're not afraid to do it. Okay, the broker consultant who's the head for that employer client, they're incredibly in the details. They sweat the small stuff because they know to give their client great service, they've got to sweat the small stuff. So they don't I just do the high-level strategic work. No, they're totally into the details. And guess what? That's to the great benefit of their employer client. And then finally, they tend to be a lot of brokers, interestingly, in the South, the Midwest, but also the Pacific Northwest as well. So again, this is actually a fantastic opportunity because if you're a guard dog broker consultant in the Northeast where there's a bunch of lapdogs, then that's a tremendous opportunity for you. Or in Chicago or in Denver. So huge opportunity there for you to win over business. So we'll see. We'll see if the CAA plus high healthcare costs plus a potential recession that we're going to have is going to see a shift from employers from misaligned broker consultants that are lapdogs for the carrier to more aligned broker consultant guard dogs. And that's my point for today. Thank you for watching AHealthcareZ.